Hello all to How to Write a Workflow. This is a session we're going to try and do monthly. It's basically for the inner workings of CRM, maybe showing or exposing how you can sort of accomplish certain things or do certain tasks, hopefully make your life easier. And this first session is how to write a workflow. I'm going to try and talk and do examples and show things for somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. These can get sticky, so I'm going to try and give general answers, and then we'll be able to follow up if anybody needs to. So I wish I had looked at this more than 5 minutes in advance to change the picture. I'm Greg Costello, and then also on the line with me is Julie Davis. We'll try and cover any questions at the end. Julie will probably field them and send anything to me.
And yes, and just so that everybody knows as well, hi, I'm Julie Davis, Director of Marketing for Altai. And I just wanted to let you all know you are all on mute. But if you have questions, as Grant said, we will absolutely get to them. But please just be sure to put them either in the chat box or under the Q&A box. So take it away, Grant. Thanks.
Sure. So we're going to just do a quick example. This is the agenda, and I'll just walk through it. We're going to do a quick example just to show sort of a real easy workflow. We're going to talk about when you might use workflows in lieu of maybe a plugin or a business process, a dialogue, actions, and sort of when each might be applicable and when workflows might be the best option. We're going to talk about how workflows are going to run via either synchronous or asynchronous. That's pretty quick. And then we'll talk about the actions, like what can workflows actually do for you and how you add them in. And then we're going to sort of tie it all a little bit together in an invoice example and run a test of that, and then we'll take questions. So obviously this is an intro and by no means exhaustive. As a follow-up, or maybe at the end of this agenda, I think we will have a few resources where you can look and find more information if you'd like. So I'm going to jump over to one of our organizations here. This is just an internal dev system, so the data is not great and it's not the fastest, but it'll have everything that we need. So I'm just at that main screen here, and real high level, like I said, we're going to start with an example. From the main screen where I am, I'm going to get to settings, and then I'm going to get to processes. Workflows are entirely base CRM, so I believe everybody on the call it has the Altai components, but this is a Microsoft component, so there's going to be a lot more documentation and a lot more resources out there if you ever get stuck or need help. So I'm going to do a new, well, first I'll explain what we're going to do. So I have a contact record here, and I just picked one at random because they had an invoice for a later example. But we have this field here, sort name, and in my organization, I just want to make sure that sort name is going to show up as last comma space first space middle, and that way if I sort the name, they sort of show up in the order that I would kind of normally expect them if you were thinking of alphabetical sorting. That doesn't happen automatically, like by default you can only have a couple of sorts, right? So maybe you did last name, maybe you did first name, maybe you do it by member type, whatever. But we'll do a quick example here. So I just have two tabs open so I can flip back and forth. Hopefully it doesn't get confusing. But under settings, under processes, I'm going to hit new. My process name, I'll just call sort name. Category is giving me a few options. Notice these are required fields. This is going to be a workflow. We'll talk about this is just our first example, but we will talk about sort of the other options that are in there and some that aren't in there that are, other things you could use to sort of accomplish similar functions. So mine's a workflow, and then entity. In our case, because it's on the contact, we're going to, our workflow runs on the contact. Now, the name I can change, but after that, once I've saved this, I can't go back and change the entity. So you want to sort of try and make sure plan out and know the entity that you want to start on before you've gotten too far. Okay, so I'll go over all this stuff when we get into actions, but I'm just going to, one, make sure that this runs not just for me, but for everybody. So I could write some workflows that maybe were specific to my function, my job, and they would run for me, but they wouldn't run for everybody else. Commonly, I think most of these workflows are applicable. You know, maybe it doesn't matter who made the name change on that contact record. You want this the sort name to be updated. You don't want it to happen if it's just you. So most of the workflows are going to be organization ones. I do want this to run when a contact is created, but I also want it to run whenever some fields change. Okay, and so this is, when is this workflow going to get kicked off? The trigger for when this runs, right? So yeah, I want it to run when a new contact gets created so that it populates their sort name, but I also want it to run when some fields change, right? The only ones that are really relevant to me for this really sort of small example is whenever the first name, middle name, or last name change. And so it's by display name, so first name, last name, middle name. Okay, whenever any of those change, then I want this to kick off and do its work. Here's where I would add, you know, now that I've said when I want this workflow to run, now I have to sort of enter all the details of what this particular workflow should do. Again, we'll go through all of the sort of possible actions and how you might want to write these. I'm going to have it update this record. Now, by default, when you say update, it's going to assume you're updating the record that the workflow runs on. When you say create, it's going to assume you're creating the same type of record the workflow runs on, and you can kind of, you know, you can change it from there. When I'm updating, it has to be something, you know, I can update the record I'm on, or I can update something that's related, right? I can have it so that whenever I update the contact, it can go to their parent account or something like that, but it can't go to, you know, some random unrelated entity or part of the system that's got no relationship, right? They need to have sort of some relationship together. So like the contact has a parent account, and so when this workflow runs, I could say, hey, you know, a contact changed their profile and set a date on the account as, you know, last time a contact was logged in or something like that. In our case, we are updating the contact, so we'll just stick here. And then once I've chosen the type of record that's being updated, in fact, in this case, the same one, I'm just going to go to set properties. What this does is it opens up a mock version, whether you're updating or creating, it opens up kind of a mock version of what our form in this organization at least looks like, and gives us access to all those fields. So the contact is potentially updating, or a staff person is potentially updating the first name, the middle name, or the last name, right? And those are the only things this is going to kick off on. And so I want to have the sort name get set to, not that, the last name. And then the yellow is dynamic, but I can type in there. And so now that's static text, first name, middle name. And it did add that, it's just that it, you know, wrapped down. Okay, so that's perfect. Now, if this were and that's all I wanted to update, your form, that mock version of the form has all the fields. It actually, I probably should have gone into that too. It does have, you know, so everything is on here. And even if you have fields that are on the entity, like the fields that exist but aren't visible on the form, you see all those in this sort of really bottom section. That's everything that's not being shown. So we have a bunch of fields, you know, in this environment, we're not showing address 2 or address 3 or, you know, some other stuff. So if there's a field that you want to update, maybe that's not visible, right? It's not something that staff look at, but it just increments a counter or updates a date that says, hey, yeah, they updated their profile type thing. You can get to all that there. So you can get fields even if they're not available on there. Okay, so the only other thing I did here, it's, you know, obviously this is a really simple workflow. It just says start whenever they change is created, the record's created, or whenever they change first, middle, or last. And then I told it what to do, update the sort name field, and then I activated it, right? So a workflow is only going to run if it's activated, right? You can tell that it's going to say deactivate there now, so it's just a button in the ribbon. And you can do it from here as well if you click, you know, in the ribbon here, or the action menu, I'm sorry. So I've got my, my contact here. Now, let's change our name. So this isn't a great lady's last name, but my middle name is Dalton, so I'm going to save that. I guess I put that in there, sorry. Hopefully that gets overwritten. Okay, so the workflow is running. Now workflows sort of by default are asynchronous, meaning they're running behind the scenes after 5-10 seconds, sort of as soon as CRM says, oh, okay, you know, not a lot going on right now, so I'm gonna, you know, go and complete that workflow action that you wanted to see. So I can go to workflows and see it ran and succeeded. So I can see the history of that in here. And they are going to, there are something that you can tell the workflow. Once you've run, go ahead and clear that out. And I think that will by default, so we'll see what it does there. But mine ran, and so if I were to refresh, I would hope and bet that it's going to be Takamine, Jasmine, Dalton in the sort name. Okay, I don't need that. No. I hope I didn't, sorry. I think I cleared it when I deleted first, middle, last. So. Okay, sorry about that. Failure to launch there. So I updated, I don't know, hopefully it's apparent that I'm not trying to, that I didn't totally blow that, but when I erased the fact that I had put in some text there, it erased what was actually there and overwrote what our workflow had put. So I just changed it again and let it rerun that. So now it's put in there, hey, Dalton 2, and you can see if I change it a second time, writes it again. What you'd probably do in this case, if this were sort of a real example, is make this sort name sort of a read-only field so that people don't do exactly what I did and overwrite something and clear it and all that nonsense. So, but that's just a simple example of a real quick, you know, sort name. That's my, you know, my quick and easy workflow that is done. So let's take a look at the items on our agenda. The first were one of the items is, and I'm going to use this sort name workflow that we've got here as an opportunity to sort of talk about the different pieces of it. One is most logic in CRM is either a workflow or a plugin. Now, the difference being plugins are managed code that a developer has to go, write, do, and if they need to make a change to it, it takes a developer to go back in, make that change. It has to be recompiled and done. Anything that's a real complex action does really still work best in a plugin. Plugins do have a few limitations in that they can't run more than 2 minutes. So if it's something that takes sort of a long time to execute, it can't run. And they can do sort of really complex actions. So if you have something like calls out to a web service and figures out how much shipping is supposed to be or anything like that, it really is better left in a plugin. Stuff like when you make a payment on an invoice and the balance due goes down immediately and users need to see that immediately, that's best in a plugin, and our plugins do handle that. The other options in here that plugins aren't listed in here because they get registered differently, but the other options in here are action, business process flow, dialogue, and workflow. We're talking about workflow. So the rest of these, a dialogue is similar to a workflow, except it allows the user to give you some input, right? So a dialogue is run for one single record, whereas I can run a workflow against up to 250 at a time, right? Up to a full page. So a dialogue is something where you'd say, the user says, okay, start the refund dialogue, which is one of the ones that we have that, as standard. Start the refund dialogue. And the dialogue says, okay, user, how much money would you like to refund? And then user, potentially, which batch would you like that refund to be in, right? It's asking the user for input. So a dialogue takes it can only be run for one record at a time, but it takes answers or takes direction from the user at when it's being run in order to execute, right? To provide all the data that it needs. A workflow has to be self-contained, right? It can't say that same thing, right? It can't ask the user which batch to use, or, hey, do you want to use their first name or their last name, for the nickname? It has to know the answer and get it based on, oh, okay, well, if they have an email address, then I'll send an email. And if they don't have an email address, well, then I'll make a note to, schedule a phone call, right? And that's the workflow. It looks at the data in the system and makes all the decisions from that. Okay. A business process flow is something that indicates some of the, and dialogues, I apologize, can do basically all the same actions, all the same, create record, update record, delete record, assign, change status, all that stuff. You can do the same stuff in a dialogue as you could a workflow. And so they're very similar there. But again, workflows you can run in mass, but they can't take any input. Dialogues, you can only run one record at a time, but you can get data or get responses from the user along the way. A business process is a little bit in between. It's something that you would do on the form, and it can be synchronous, right? Remember my workflow, we went and said, okay, change the middle name, or in our case, we changed the middle name, and then we saved the record, and it ran, but it was behind the scenes. In order to see it, I had to refresh the record. That's because it runs asynchronously behind the scenes. When it's a business process flow, it's something on a form, right? Like it's something about or similar to when somebody fills in I don't know, fax number or something like that, then it goes through and does a quick validation on it, or it makes another field. If you fill in that you have an email address, it makes required, oh, can we mark it to you or not? Yes, no, and you have to select one of these fields type thing. So it is synchronous and forms stuff like that, where you can say, well, if they answer A here, then ask them this question, or make this a required field elsewhere on the form. That kind of work. Okay, so that's a business process flow, and it does similar things to that. So it's almost like a way of doing what used to be done through JavaScript, except in the UI and on the page there synchronously. Actions are pretty neat. They allow custom things, just like workflows will, custom actions. They're things like resolve that case, convert that lead to an opportunity. The good thing about actions, and actions can include custom code. The good thing about them is once you've written an action, it can be used either in a workflow, in a dialogue, or by a developer elsewhere saying, hey, call Grant's custom action that, is this member is going to be terminated action, right? We can have code call that and do sort of the same thing. That way it works the same whether you use it in a workflow or a dialogue or anything else. And so custom actions are pretty neat, and they're newer. I believe they're new in either 2015 or 2016. So depending on which version of CRM you're in, that'll potentially be there or not, but it's in the later ones. So I want to take a look at our sort name, and we'll use that as the basis sort of for the rest of this. So this is deactivated, so it's not running right now. This button here at the top says convert to a real-time workflow. So as I said, workflows sort of by default, by their nature, are going to be asynchronous, meaning they're going to run behind the scenes. And that's going to be, if you had 100 people sitting in rooms, 100 people entering contact records all day trying to do some data migration, or a whole bunch of interns or something, and there's a lot going on in the system, that workflow says, CRM's really busy right now, so I'm going to wait a little bit, and it's probably not super important that I update the sort name immediately. I can wait 15, 30 seconds, a minute. before running. It's never, it's never going to be unless the system is sort of like running, tens of thousands of these, and it's just behind from that regard, that there's so many queued up that it hasn't processed them. But a workflow usually is not going to wait more than 15, 30 seconds to run. You saw ours ran very quickly. Nobody else was in here. So it was relatively quick. But a workflow runs asynchronously. The alternative is you can make this a real-time workflow, and it's similar to the way plugins work, where or most plugins will work, which is synchronous, meaning as soon as you hit the button and hit save, the workflow runs, and before the screen even comes back, your change has taken place. Okay, so if I were to convert this to a real-time workflow and activate, well, now instead of me having to save, I just say, okay, Jasmine Dalton 3. Well, when I hit save, I don't have to refresh. It automatically does it, right? It's there between the time that the save happens and the page, in this case, doesn't even need to refresh. It's already updated the data. So it's synchronous and it's sort of live, which looks great. But what that does is it puts a lot of pressure on the system to have to do everything that you've got in, not only does it save the contact record, save the middle name that I did, maybe there's plugins that happen, like maybe it's a payment on an invoice that ultimately pays a membership, which ultimately makes that membership paid, which ultimately causes the contact record to have to get updated. So there's sometimes sort of a string of actions that happen behind the scenes. And if you tack on these workflows on top of it, it can be too much. These are done the way that the transaction sort of happens, where it updates the database, it causes this logic to run, and then continues and responds back. Sometimes that can take too long. So you can run them synchronously like that, and you can sort of be the judge if it's relevant, right? Sort name probably is not and would not need to be synchronous, but that's what it would look like. So you can be the judge there. We would recommend that you do not make a workflow real-time or synchronous if it is something that is on the invoice or potentially the participation, event registration, payment, stuff that commonly gets interacted with the portal, because those, if you have a workflow that says, oh, when they make a new registration, go automatically add them to 50 different sessions for this annual conference. Well, it's going to take time to add those 50 new session records. And the portal is a lot less forgiving, right? When somebody says, great, add this $100 registration to the cart, hit checkout, they want to be done, right? They want that page to come back immediately. And when you make a real-time workflow like that, it forces CRM to have to say, oh, okay, I'm going to go make these 50 different session registrations all before they can see the next page that just says, thank you for your $100 payment. Everything's great. Shop with us again, or whatever, whatever that receipt or confirmation page says. So we do recommend that you not use real-time workflows when we can avoid them on sort of the transactional entities, like invoice, payment, participation, and maybe event registration, potentially some others. So try to avoid that if possible. You do have some other options, as you can see here, when it is a real-time workflow, and these basically have to do with when should it run? Should it run before or after the action? Who should it run as? Does it look like it runs as the person who made the change, change this middle name, the user, whomever that was, or does it look like it's the person who created the workflow, you in that case? So those are some of the options that you've got. I'm going to try and convert that back. I hope I clicked that. Maybe not. It takes a second to go back and forth between a real-time and a normal asynchronous workflow. So that when we looked at the history of the workflow and said, yep, it was running. Let's see if it's still there, so I can point this out. Great. It'll clear these on occasion, but essentially you can click and see when you look at the workflow, the history of, okay, it executed here. Mine's very, very simple, but you can see, okay, this was done, this was, this field was executed, then it checked this condition, and then it jumped around. So you'll see these little green checks. Oh, okay, here I didn't change the address, so it doesn't have any reason to update anything, but it said, oh, did you change state? Nope. Okay. Okay. Well, did you change state too? Nope. Okay. Right. So it does this check, and then if it met this condition, you'd see a little check mark here. So you can kind of, at least for more complex workflows than just set name, you can see a little bit more of the details of how it was run, what happened there, what ran. So let's talk about the available actions, right? We've talked about probably ad nauseum, how they run and asynchronous and synchronous, stuff like that. Let's talk about what you can do. I would usually recommend that most workflows start with a check condition so that you can go in and say, okay, this workflow could potentially start, and when a person is deleting their middle name and last name and first name, well, maybe I want that to clear short name as well. And maybe I want that to say, no, this is no longer valid. If they don't have at least a last name and a first name, then don't do this action, right? I wouldn't want just a comma there. So maybe I have to check a condition to say, only do it if it meets these certain criteria. So it's usually smart to start workflows. This isn't going to start with it. It's going to be underneath the action. But okay, check to see if there's a first and last name first. So usually you'd want to start with a condition. And the way you do that is it's similar to the advanced find tool that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but you basically say, check condition, and then say, okay, well, I'm on the contact. I do have access to the, maybe only do this if their parent company is X, Y, or Z, or something over there. So only do this if first name contains data and last name. Oops. Oh, I'm the worst at that. Last name contains data, right? And so there I've got, hey, if it meets this condition, then do this action, right? And if it doesn't, it defaults out or it checks for the next condition, et cetera. So you can check conditions, and that's a good idea to do that. That way your workflow doesn't run when you don't intend it to. You can tell it to wait, right? You may say, okay, the system has a whole lot going on when I create registration, so I want it to wait for 5 minutes and then go add them to those 50 sessions. That way it's not sort of holding them up on the portal. It waits, they're already done, and then I come back later and do all the adding that I needed to do. Or on an invoice, when an invoice is created, wait 15 minutes. And if at the end of that 15-minute period, they still have a balance due, then send them a statement that says, hey, this invoice is getting old, maybe pay it, right? Maybe not 15 minutes, maybe it's 30 days, right? And then send them a statement automatically saying, hey, you still have this invoice out here where you owe X, thanks. So you can do waits. When you do a check condition, like when I do this, and I've checked a condition, I can have a conditional branch. So it's if, and then if I do this, it says, okay, well, if it doesn't meet that condition, then otherwise, if, does it meet this condition? Okay, and then if I don't want it to do either of those, and at the end of this decision tree, okay, it didn't meet any of these other options, and so here is the final action that I want to do. Okay, so I've got that, if, else, if, else, if, else. Once you can do parallel wait branches, like I said, you could say, hey, wait 30 days, and then start another workflow up that says wait 60 days, and then start another one that says wait 90 days, and they're all waiting, they're all going, right? And then at 30 days, the first one runs, at 60 days, the next one runs, and then at 90 days, the next one runs, and maybe they're all, after 60, after 30, after 60, after 90, it checks for the balance due and sends them a notice that says, hey, you still have this open balance invoice here. So that would be like a parallel wait branch. So the standard actions, all those are sort of the configuration of how it checks and sees when it should run. Once you want to do some work, right, that you're trying to automate, these are the standard actions: creating a record, your basic, CRUD, create a record, update a record, not technically read a record, but then delete a record if you needed to. So you can create a record, and here it would let you create basically anything. You say, okay, well, I'm creating, and it's got the whole list of entities in your system, with a couple exceptions. You can't create, if you notice, an invoice detail, so you couldn't use a workflow, at least without some custom code to add line items to an invoice. We've done some custom code to do exactly that in certain instances. But so there's with a few exceptions, you can basically create any invoice, any entity that you'd like, right? And when you get to that entity, again, when you hit set properties, you just see that mock version of the form that you can do something to. Okay. Update a record. When you do update, right, like we did here, we updated the contact. When you do that, remember, we started from the contact, so that's what it's going to think we're trying to update by default. If we're not, we have to update something that's related to that contact. I could say that when the contact does, X, Y, or Z, update the parent organization, parent contact, or something about the owning user, the CRM user who owns that record, send them an email or do whatever. But there has to be some relation. It's not every entity in the whole system. It's only the ones that have some kind of a connection to the contact that you can update the record. Assign record is really not relevant for a lot of the organizations that we work with. It is if you're a little bit more security minded and you guys restrict who can see what. Maybe you have like a sales staff and only they can see, they can only see their region or something like that. And you want to assign people, when the address changes, you want to assign it to the new salesperson for that area or whatever. Maybe it's not sales directly, but membership, retention and membership growth type team that reaches out to folks, that kind of thing. Send email is one that's on its own, and we're gonna take a look at one of them. But you can say send email, and it creates the message and automatically sends it. You can also not coincidentally, but you can also create an email record, right? So I can choose to send an email, or I can choose to create an email. And then do some work on it, and then sort of later update that email and say, yep, send. So that's why you see send email there separately, because it will automatically send this, whereas if you just create a record and that record is the email entity, it won't send that automatically. You have to kind of perform a second action to send it. You can start a child workflow too. So I could have this so that whenever this workflow kicks off, it says, make sure that the parent account is up to date, right? And then start some child workflow that runs on the account. You can do that if you have sort of a set series of actions that need to be performed and you want to keep these workflows pretty modular. You can say, okay, this is going to do, A, B, and C, and I have a separate workflow, start the child workflow to complete A, right? And then start the separate workflow for completing B, right? So you can sort of keep things modular there. Perform action is, it will call, sort of like starting a child workflow, it will call one of those custom actions that we were talking about that you can do. Unlock pricing, mark this paid, right? Convert this opportunity to an invoice, close this opportunity, that kind of thing. So these are the sorts of things that are actions, right? Lock pricing on the invoice, unlock pricing on the invoice, that kind of stuff. Okay. And this list can grow, right? You can make your own sort of custom actions. That would be a developer or somebody writing sort of custom actions that you could then call all over the place. So it gives you the ability to have custom code, but then users that can be a little bit more flexible can choose when that should be run. Maybe in the future, we just want it to be first name, last name. Well, if it's in a plugin, it's a lot harder to change than if we have this workflow where I could just come in and say, do this action, or instead of first name, last name, middle, just make it first name, last name, right? I can be a little bit more on the fly and quicker to react to things that change in the business world, what you're doing. Change status. So this is asking about a record status. This is getting, unwieldy to look at, so I apologize. But this changes status. Changes status. It's talking about like active to inactive. Not, so it's not a ton of, not a ton of status options. The contact has a few because it has them, but most entities are really just going to have active and inactive. So that's not a great, it's not usually what people think of when they say status. And then stop workflow. So when I'm doing this, I can have my workflow that says, okay, if they have an email address, do A, B, C, and then stop. If they don't have an email address, but they have a phone number, then do, D, E, F and stop. And if they don't have either of those, then just stop that workflow. So you can choose to stop the workflow. And when you add the action for stopping a workflow, you can say, yes, I've stopped this because the workflow is done and there's nothing else I need to do. Or you can stop it and say, this workflow is canceled because, you know, they didn't meet some condition or there was some problem, you know, whatever the case was. So you want to, when you stop a workflow, you should indicate whether it's successful or canceled. Successful, in this top section here, when we looked at this checkbox here, when a workflow is done and it's successful, it'll clear out, you know, eventually after, you know, on a whatever 10, 15-minute schedule. So if it is marked, you know, if you stop it and say it was successful, it will clear. If you stop it and say canceled, to CRM, that essentially means error, and it's not going to remove it. And so, you know, maybe you know, it either is or it isn't a specifically sort of to denote an error, but just keep that in mind. It won't get cleared out if it says canceled. It'll basically stay because it thinks, you know, cancel is not the ideal state for a workflow. You can still clear those. I mean, you can still have a job that, you know, once a month deletes all the canceled workflows or whatever, but canceled will often, you know, without me sort of putting the action of canceled in there, canceled usually means it was sort of a problem, you know, something went wrong, hit a code error, you know, somewhere, something like that. Okay. All right. So let's do a quick example of what a workflow might be, a little bit more in-depth example. So I'm going to make a workflow off of the invoice entity. Okay. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to call a custom action, which I now realize I forgot to talk about. So I will. I'm going to call a custom action. It's actually a piece of custom code, right? So it's not one of the standard, you know, create record, update record, delete record, you know, assign record. It's not those. It is something that calls a little tiny piece of custom code that a developer would write and deploy that then can be used by users in a workflow. And it, you know, just to make stuff easier. So it's similar to like what we called actions. And so in our example, we want to send an email saying, hey, there's a balance due invoice here. Okay. And so the first thing the first thing I did was I said new workflow. It is a workflow. It is for the invoice entity. The scope, as I said, is probably most often going to be an organization. In my case, I'm not going to have it start automatically, right? If I were to, you know, this is going to be like essentially a receipt or an invoice. And one of the quirks of CRM is, you know, most of you would recognize you create the invoice and it's blank, and then you start adding lines to it. Well, CRM doesn't know that, you know, on the registration form in front of your desk, there were 10 lines on it, but you only got through 5 and then you left to go get lunch or something. So it doesn't understand when you're done versus when you just pause, right? It doesn't know when you've added the very last line ever to kick off. So I don't want this to automatically go out, but you could have, like we had said, you know, wait 15 minutes and then send, you know, wait 24 hours and then email or whatever. You know, if you haven't made a payment by then it probably isn't paid. Okay, and so my options were the record was created, the status. This is not used as commonly as you think, right? Because I'm talking about status, which is usually active and inactive, you know, or vice versa, right? Back and forth between them. It's not commonly what people think of when they're thinking, oh, I want my workflow to run on a status change. Record is assigned. Again, I talked about how that's not super relevant. And then maybe balance due changes or paid amount changes. Maybe I'm just worried, at least at the invoice level, that's going to run too often. And then when a record is deleted, obviously you could do that. Now we did this with our sort name workflow, but you can pick the fields. If you're going to say, you know, kick this off and run it whenever this particular field changes, you can pick any of the fields from that entity. Here we're not gonna. I'm going to make this an on-demand one so that I'm the trigger for this workflow. There is no automatic trigger. It is just me. The first thing I want to do is if balance due is greater than 0, then do this action. And if not, I don't want that to run. Okay, and so you'll see that little white box there where it offers me the ability to put in some text. It's you know, you'd think that these are going to be self-explanatory when you're reading them, and you know, sometimes they are, right? Obviously the sort name one is, but they can get complex, and so it is a good idea to sort of document what you're doing and why, in this text area, because if you have to come back to this workflow 6 months from now and figure out why you did a particular thing, or maybe, maybe it's not you, it's somebody else on the team because you're out that day and something's going wrong. So it is a good idea to document these. Developers do that kind of thing all the time. If I open a piece of code that I've written, more than 3 months ago, I'm like, this looks terrible. Who wrote this? So if you don't write down sort of what you're thinking while you're doing it, it does help later on. Okay. So if the balance due is greater than 0, what I want to have happen is I can do all these actions and all this setup stuff here. I actually want to perform a custom action, and so I'm going to choose this one, and apologize, it's going to be hard to read because of my resolution, but there is a custom action that is called HTML template by name. So if you're used to sending emails through CRM, you probably know that you can sort of set up emails that use the standard out of the box, dear insert this, contact first name, dear, here's your balance due, insert balance due, that kind of thing. So here, this is a custom piece of code that essentially has an email template. It has a big HTML block, and it's going to let me sort of embed it into the system. So hopefully I remember this. So whenever it's something that needs a little bit more input, you have to configure it, right? This is basically set properties, right? When I did sort name, it was, put in the name. Here it is, what is the invoice I'm running on, and what is my template? And my invoice template is called invoice template A.A. And those are the other things. This is a custom piece, and let me sidetrack for a second here. What this is in AMS system preferences. I have a preference that has that same name that I just put in. Okay, and in there, which you could barely see because I clicked through it, was this block of HTML. Actually, it's better if you look at the tooltip. So it has this block of HTML, and in here, it's essentially supposed to look like an invoice. Okay, but you'll see stuff here where it substitutes some text and everything. So I don't want to go into this. We can, if this interests you, I can do a follow-up. But essentially, this is what it's using as the basis for sending that email. And so if I click on set properties, I believe I filled that out correctly. Okay, this is real simple. I could come in here and say, well, after this action, stop that workflow, and then if it doesn't have a balance due, then either, maybe create a note for the person who ran it and say, hey, this wasn't applicable, so they know something didn't go wrong, or, in my case, I'll just say, hey, stop it, we're done. Okay, so before I can use it, I'm going to click activate and activate. Okay, and then underneath of Jasmine, I'm going to go to invoices, and she happens to have an invoice here for a $165 invoice where she's made a payment on it, so it's partially paid, but balance due is still greater than 0. And so I want to run that workflow. Now, we looked at workflows, right? When I changed the sort name, it happened automatically. Here, I am the trigger, right? I didn't put an automatic trigger in, which you can do both, right? You can say, change it whenever they change the name, and change it whenever a user says to run it, right? So that on-demand box was always available. I can say run workflow, and our example, how-to workflow invoice example that we just created at 2:35, whatever that was, right? So I can say run that workflow here, and I'll let that run. And I can also, that was from like a list of invoices. I could also come and do it when I'm on one invoice, okay? That says, hey, run that workflow, okay? The beauty about workflows, though, is if I'm not running it on one, I can select really this system doesn't have tons of data in it, but I could select a whole bunch of invoices, right? Here I selected 12. I could select all of them in this list, right? And it's 53, but it could be up to 250, where I can then run this workflow and say that same one, send them this invoice, right? Email that invoice out. So once I've run that workflow, it runs off. This is the person that it was on. Essentially, I'm just going to go back and pull it up and take a look. It'll show up under closed activities. Oh, I am distracting myself. I apologize. So I only did half the workflow. So what this does is come up with that HTML block. And the next thing I want to do is send an email. Okay, so I've come up with the HTML block and I want to create an email. And I want to send this as Frank Costello. I want to send it to the customer of this invoice. And this is essentially, I'm just going to be real quick here because I'm going over what I wanted to, over my time limit. So that custom action that I ran, you can find it. What it does is it creates a record, right? So if you had said create task or create email, and then you wanted to update the email later, once you've done something in a workflow, you can find it here. What that workflow did is give me this little HTML block. Okay? And so what I want to do is paste it in there. And now I'll reactivate that. Sorry, it has to work. Okay, and if we see our workflow, this was the one that didn't have any rules in it. Oops. Okay, so remember, it clears those records out when they're done. So I should have unchecked this box if I really wanted to see it there. But I can go into closed activities and see my email that I just created at 2:46. I know I'm over time. But essentially what it does is that block, instead of being left with just static text, that lets me use a template that looks a little bit more like an invoice. It still looks wonky in here in this viewer, but essentially it lets me say, oh, okay, here's what's on your invoice. This was the total, and you've made a couple payments, and so they are here, and it lists them out. And these are obviously, this is sort of bad data, but that's what the workflow action does, which is too complicated for just a standard workflow, but you can tie in custom code and actions to sort of accomplish something a little bit more, that would look more like an email. So this is a dev system. I don't know that it's actually ever going to go out. I think it might just sit there as pending send, but this would be, it's given it the tracking number and everything, and in your environments, it would have gone out. Okay, so that was all that I had for examples, and I want to go over any questions. Workflow questions, I guess, can get a little bit tricky, so I'll try and answer them from a general standpoint, and then when we get to the end, when we're out of time, I can sort of make the commitment that if you guys email me and say, hey, this is the scenario I'm thinking about, I can try and give you a little bit more specificity in an answer or a suggestion or what you might try to accomplish what you're looking for. So I will defer to Julie to let any questions.
Great. I do see one. It was more, I would say, of a comment than a question early on. An individual noted that we might want to note that if the field is read-only, you will have to open it up before doing the updated workflow.
That is an excellent point. So remember when we looked at the workflows and we had to sort of open that mock form? And I even said during the thing, hey, you'd probably want to lock that field. Well, it does, in order for you to open that mock form and enter okay, insert last name in comma space, insert first name. In order to do that, it has to be an editable field. If it's read-only on the form, when you open the mock form, it's also read-only, so you can't touch it. And so to that person's point, which is exactly correct, I take it for granted, but that is exactly correct. You have to sort of modify the form so the field is editable, create your workflow where you've set properties and fill in that field when it is editable, and then you can go back and modify the form to say, make it read-only, at which point your workflow still runs because you've already written it and it already had the ability to edit that field, but it's now read-only on your actual form that's deployed. Good point. Thank you.
Great. We have another question. Our CRM has many workflows. What advice can you offer for finding which workflow needs troubleshooting?
Sure, true. So you can tell in workflows, it's a tough, there's no straight answer, but you can tell when you get into settings and then processes. This is mine, so it's a small list. What I will commonly do is sort that by the primary entity. And usually I can tell, okay, if something's going haywire and it's on the invoice, well, then I can sort the list and say, okay, here are my only items on that particular entity, right? Even though I have 25 all over the system, most of them aren't relevant. So invoice, participation, contact account, those are common ones where you have a lot. There's no great answer there. You can sort the list by entity. Once you've got that, it's hopefully a smaller list, though, like I said, if it's one of those main ones like invoice or participation or contact, there still could be a number on there. You want to go through them and start sort of just basically go through them one by one and look at the trigger, right? Some of them are going to be on demand only, in which case you don't have to worry about that being an automatic triggered workflow. You can, it is ideal if people use a sort of a good name for it so that it's clear, what it is, but not a great answer there. You could, if you were really, really stuck, you could go through and selectively deactivate, sets of workflows, and if, like if I had 5 here or whatever, 4 or 5, I could do them one by one. Or you can, if you had 50, I might go in and deactivate 25 of them and then see if it still happens. And if it, if it does or doesn't, I know which of the 25, which set of 25 it's in, and then turn around and deactivate 12 or 13 of the remaining ones. And then I know, try it again. And if it still happens, or if it doesn't happen, I know which set of the 12 or 13 that it's in, that kind of thing. So use kind of a development thing called like a bubble sort, but essentially use that to sort of narrow down where it's coming from. Good question. Not a clean answer though.
All right. Any other questions? I'm not seeing any pop up at the moment. Give people a second maybe to digest those answers and see if they have any further questions. Okay. Well, I'm not seeing any pop up. So.
Okay, that's fine. So, if at the point when you sort of look through this, if anything comes up, or if you have something that's specific to your organization that might need a little bit more background than a quick text, feel free to shoot it to me. Workflow is a completely standard, out of box Microsoft CRM thing. So obviously the component where it made that HTML block, that's an Altai component, that custom action, and you could write your own, or you can reuse any of ours if you have some piece that we've got that you might be able to utilize elsewhere. You can reuse those. It's a standard CRM functionality of workflows. So there's tons and tons and tons. You can go on YouTube and find videos of people doing workflows, doing different things. There's a lot of documentation on it since it's core Microsoft, not specifically Altai. So check it out. I think at the bottom of this agenda, probably as a follow-up, and this is being recorded in case you wanted to review that. If you saw anything today that you have a question on, or like I said, if you have a question that's specific for you guys, feel free to reach out.
And just to piggyback on that, yes, everyone will be getting a follow-up email. It will have a link to this recording. You may not get it till tomorrow, just to let you guys know, because sometimes the recording takes longer than I'd like to upload, but I definitely will get it to you by tomorrow. In addition, in that email, follow-up email, will also be some resources that Grant had mentioned earlier, as well as a link to a very quick survey. We hope that you can take just a few minutes to answer, just to help us continually improve our services and our presentations to you. In that vein, I just want to make sure that you guys know that our next hashtag, Webinar Wednesday, is going to be the Office 365 Part 2, Work Less and Do More. Registration is open for that. We anticipate it's going to fill up. So please, if you're interested in that, don't hesitate to register. And our next client-only webinar, as Grant has said, we're doing that. We're kicking that off today, and we're doing this monthly now. It's going to be February 28th, and it's going to be our AngularJS portal demo. That link is not currently live, but everyone will get an email as soon as that link is up, which should be by the end of this week. So again, well, thank you so much for your time today. Grant, thank you for your presentation, and we hope that you have a great day.
Thanks, Julie.